The bottle of wine slipped out of Adrian's hands the moment she heard his voice from upstairs. Not a stranger's voice, not the television, her husband's voice. Low, careful, the way he spoke when he was trying not to be heard. Coming through the ceiling of their kitchen while she stood there, holding the Merlot she'd picked up on the way home from the office. The bottle she'd bought because it was their anniversary and she'd thought, maybe tonight, they could just sit and breathe and remember why they'd started. The bottle didn't break. It hit the tile and rolled under the counter, leaving a small red streak near the grout. She didn't go upstairs right away. She stood there for a long moment, listening to the silence that followed, and told herself it was nothing. She was tired. She'd been working 16-hour days for the past 6 weeks closing out the Hargrove acquisition, the deal that had finally put Callaway and Webb's name on the map, the deal she'd spent 3 years quietly engineering from the inside. She was hearing things. Then she heard a laugh, soft. Definitely not Connor. She went upstairs. The bedroom door was half open. She pushed it the rest of the way. Connor Whitfield was sitting on the edge of their bed and beside him, wearing one of Adrian's college sweatshirts, the faded navy one she'd had since Georgetown, the one that still smelled like her old life, was a woman named Shay. Adrian recognized her. Shay worked 3 floors below them at the firm. 29 years old. The smart wasn't what she saw. The worst part was the way Connor looked at her. Not with shame. With calculation. The look of a man who had already run the numbers and decided how this would go. Adrienne? He said, I can explain. She didn't say a word. She walked to the closet, took out the overnight bag she kept packed for work trips and left. That night, sitting in a hotel room in downtown Charlotte with a glass of water she kept forgetting to drink, she replayed every moment of the past year. The nights he came home late. The weekend conferences she hadn't been invited to. The way he'd started talking about her work, like it was a favor she was doing him. Not the thing that had paid their mortgage for the last 4 years while he finished his MBA. Not the thing that had kept their health insurance and their retirement accounts intact while he figured out his next move. She pulled out her phone and called her best friend Jonah. Tell me what he did, Jonah said without hello. She told him all of it. Okay, he said, when she was done. Here's what you're going to do. You're going to sleep. Not because things are fine, but because you need your mind working tomorrow. Whatever he's planning, you need to be smarter. She didn't sleep, but she thought. By morning she understood something clearly. Connor hadn't ended up at Callaway and Webb by accident. She'd brought him in. She'd recommended him to the senior partners. She'd introduced him to every contact she'd spent years carefully building. And in the past 18 months, while she'd been closing the Hargrove acquisition, he'd been doing something else entirely. Taking meetings she didn't know about. Cultivating relationships at the firm she thought were still hers. She called her attorney before 9 o'clock. The divorce papers arrived at Connor's office 3 days later. He called her that same afternoon, the smooth, practiced concern in his voice that she now recognized for exactly what it was. Adrienne, can we talk about this like adults? We are talking like adults, she said. My attorney will be in touch with yours. You're being reactive. This doesn't have to, Connor. Her voice was steady. She hadn't known it would be, but it was. I've already talked to the firm's financial compliance office. I've also talked to 3 of the Hargrove partners directly. If you were planning to take credit for that acquisition in your next performance review, I'd reconsider. The line went quiet. I'll see you in court, she said, and hung up. What followed was 6 months that felt like standing in the middle of a construction site, loud, disorienting, dust in everything, and no clear sense of what the finished structure would look like. Connor's attorney sent aggressive demands. He wanted the lake house her parents had left her. He argued her contributions to his MBA had been a joint investment. He claimed the networking she'd done on his behalf constituted spousal career support that had been mutual and equal. Her attorney, a careful woman named Diane who wore very quiet shoes and never raised her voice, looked at Adrian across a conference table one morning and said, he's not going to get any of this, but he's going to make you prove it. So she proved it. Every email, every introduction she'd made on his behalf, every credit she hadn't taken publicly so he could build confidence. She hadn't realized how much she'd given away until she had to document it. It was the most clarifying and most devastating exercise of her professional life. The Hargrove partners testified on her behalf. 2 senior associates she'd mentored quietly submitted letters. Diane presented the timeline of the acquisition with the precision of a surgeon, and by the time the mediation was over, Connor walked away with the car he'd bought with his own money, a modest sum from their joint savings, and nothing else. He didn't speak to her again after that, not until later, when he had a reason to. Adrian moved into a smaller apartment in Midtown, a place with high ceilings and west-facing windows that turned amber in the late afternoon. She got a cat, which she'd always wanted and Connor had always resisted. She named it Bertrand, after nobody in particular, and it immediately claimed the best chair. She went back to work. Not because she'd healed, she hadn't, not yet, but because she knew who she was at work in a way she'd lost track of being who she was everywhere else. At the firm she was clear. She was good at this. Nobody could take the thing she built in her own mind. A few months after the divorce was finalized, she ended up in a meeting she hadn't expected to change much. The firm was exploring a potential merger with a mid-sized advisory group out of Atlanta called Renwick Partners. Adrian had been asked to attend as a courtesy. She was familiar with some of the overlapping clients, but she expected it to be routine. A lot of preliminary language, a lot of careful positioning, nothing decided. She arrived early, which she always did. The only other person already in the room was a man she'd seen once before. Briefly, at an industry conference 2 years ago. She'd remembered him because he'd been the only person at the conference who'd asked her a question that actually required her to think. He'd also been the only person who, when she answered, had listened to the whole answer instead of waiting to talk. His name was Jonah. No, this one was different. His name was Reed Calloway. Not related to her firm. The name was a coincidence that came up immediately and got laughed off. Renwick Partners, she said, sitting down across from him. Calloway and Webb, he said. You know Connor Whitfield? She asked, because she needed to know. Something shifted in his expression. Not evasion, but something more like honesty organizing itself. He reached out to Renwick about 8 months ago, Reed said. He was trying to establish his own client base outside the firm. We passed. She nodded slowly. Why? Because some of what he was presenting as his own work wasn't. We'd done our research. He paused. I'm sorry that happened to you. She looked at him for a moment. Thank you for saying that like it's a fact and not a question. It was a fact, he said. The meeting was supposed to last 2 hours. It lasted 4. Not because of the merger. That got tabled for further review. But because somewhere in the middle of a discussion about risk management philosophy, they'd stopped talking about the merger entirely and started talking about everything else. How she'd structured the Hargrove deal. A paper he'd read on fiduciary framework she'd also read and had opinions about. Whether Charlotte's development trajectory was sustainable. When the room started to empty, neither of them stood up right away. I'll be in Charlotte through the end of the week, he said finally. I know a good place for dinner, she said. If you want to actually eat instead of ordering room service and answering emails. I always answer emails during room service, he said. So yes. They had dinner that Wednesday. And the following Monday, because he extended his stay. And when he went back to Atlanta, they talked on the phone in a way that felt nothing like the careful, performing conversations she'd had with Connor in the last years of their marriage. These were conversations that went long and then longer, that left her feeling more awake, not more tired. She didn't tell Connor any of this. She had no reason to. They didn't speak. She had moved entirely out of the space he occupied, which is why when she ran into him at a firm event 8 months later, she wasn't prepared for what she saw in his face. He had heard about Reed. She didn't know how. These things traveled, but she could see it the moment he looked at her, the careful blankness that wasn't blank at all. He said, You look good. Thank you, she said simply. Reed Calloway, he said, testing the name in his mouth like he was checking it for edges. Renwick Partners. That's a significant connection. I'm going to grab a drink, she said. Excuse me. He followed her to the bar. She'd known he might, but she hadn't prepared a script for it, because she'd decided a long time ago that she wasn't going to perform for him anymore. You know Renwick is going to absorb half this firm's client base if that merger goes through, he said, keeping his voice reasonable, collegial, the voice of a man offering helpful intelligence. The merger's been restructured, she said. There won't be an absorption. It's a partnership model. Something flickered in his face. You're involved in structuring it? I'm leading it, she said. Good night, Connor. She walked away. Her heels were loud on the marble floor, and she didn't slow down. She heard later, through Jonah, through the quiet network of people who noticed things and said them carefully, that Connor had spent the next several weeks trying to insert himself into the merger discussions. He'd emailed Reed directly. He'd suggested to the senior partners that his history with Adrian represented a potential conflict of interest that should be disclosed. He'd called the whole thing into question without having a single factual basis to do so. Reed had forwarded the emails to Diane with a single line, "Thought you should have these." The senior partners had called Connor in for a conversation. She didn't know exactly what was said. She only knew that 3 weeks later, Connor announced he was leaving the firm. Shay had left him by then. She'd heard that too without looking for it. She didn't feel triumphant about that, exactly. She'd long passed the stage where his suffering gave her anything useful. What she felt when she heard something closer to tired recognition, like when a long process finally resolves the way everyone knew it would, and all that's left is the paperwork. The merger finalized in the spring. It was the largest deal the firm had completed in a decade, and Adrian's name was on it, not buried in the supporting documentation, not credited to a committee. Her name, her structure, her work. Reed flew in for the signing. Afterward they walked to the same restaurant where they'd had their first dinner, which had become a thing now, a habit, a place that was already accumulating meaning the way places do when you return to them with someone. "How does it feel?" he asked. She thought about it honestly. "Like something I built actually stood up," she said, "which doesn't happen as often as it should." He reached across the table and took her hand, which he did sometimes casually, like it had been happening for years. She let it, because it had. There was a moment about a month later that she hadn't expected. She was leaving the office late, end of quarter, unavoidable, and she passed Connor in the lobby. He was there to collect some final materials from HR. He looked like a man who had spent 6 months being smaller than he expected to be. He stopped when he saw her. She almost kept walking. "Adrienne. I used you," he said, not loudly, not dramatically, just flatly, like stating something he'd been turning over for a long time. "I told myself it wasn't that simple, but it was. I used everything you built and I didn't protect any of it." She looked at him for a moment. She noticed she didn't feel anything sharp, just something old and settled. "I know," she said. "I hope," he started and then stopped, like he wasn't sure he'd earned the rest of the sentence. "Good night, Connor," she said. She walked out into the cool spring air and called Reed on the way to her car. "Still working?" he said. "Just left," she said. "How's Atlanta?" "I'm actually in Charlotte," he said. "I was going to text you. Are you hungry?" She stopped walking. She looked up at the sky above the Charlotte skyline, the same sky she'd moved under when she had nothing planned and no clear idea what came next. "Yes," she said. "I'm hungry." She'd spent 4 years making someone else's future possible. Now she was building her own. Deal by deal, choice by choice, with someone who showed up in the right conference room at the right time and had the good sense to actually listen. She got in her car and drove toward the light.